Good morning. Welcome to Session 3 of Lozano Smith's Facilities and Business webinar series. Today's topic is the changing landscape of energy conservation projects. I'm Devin Lincoln. I'm a partner in Lozano Smith's Monterey office, where I focus on facilities and business issues and charter school issues, but a particular focus of my practice in recent years has been green issues, negotiating contracts for projects, negotiating the funding process, etc. And I'm joined today by Tyler Dawkins, who's going to introduce himself.
Good morning, everybody. As Devin mentioned, my name is Tyler Dawkins. I'm an associate with Lozano Smith. I'm also in the Monterey office, and I focus most of my work on facilities and business-related matters with a particular focus lately in solar contracting and other energy efficiency-related work, including Proposition 39 issues.
Okay. So getting started here today, I'm going to do some background and some context, and then Tyler's really going to take us through the nuts and bolts of where we are with Prop 39 now. And then I'm going to finish up at the end of the session with where we're going and how to really deal with the practical day-to-day questions that come with putting together a Prop 39 funded project. As I mentioned, in recent years, I've focused a lot on solar projects and to some extent energy conservation projects, but really when you talk about green projects over the past 5 years or so, the vast majority of those transactions have been solar PPAs. Solar projects generally, but PPAs in particular. And if PPA is a new term to you, I'm going to discuss it a little bit further in the session, but a PPA is a power purchase agreement. And with a power purchase agreement, the school district entity or the other public agency entity does not own the solar system that's being installed on their property. Instead, the district is permitting a private party to install that system on public property and operate that system, and then the school district purchases its electricity from that system. And I'm using the term school district here not to exclude other public agencies, but it has seemed in recent years that the majority of these transactions on public land have been taking place at schools, and there's a number of reasons for that. I think we've seen the PPA grow in popularity because there was a need and interest, and that interest was met by the market. A lot of entities jumped into the PPA business with varying degrees of success. There are some great entities out there who are still operating and probably will be for many years to come, PPA-financed solar systems on public property, but there have also been some bankruptcies, some failures along the way too. So now and in the future and in the past, it's always best to really understand who your entity is, and as I've discussed in prior sessions, it's also really important to think about how they're financed. So it's more than we're going to talk about today, but the PPA has been popular for good reasons, but also has some pitfalls. Also, as I note here, you've certainly seen a concentration of solar projects in the valley, which is no surprise. I mean, that's where you're going to generate power because you've got a lot more sunshine than we do here on the coast. Somewhat with Prop 39, I think that's going to change because we'll see, of course, funds are available to everybody in the state, all school districts in the state, and so we're going to see different projects popping up that might be smaller projects than in the past, but that will be located around the state. And then finally, I note here that oftentimes when a client would approach me in the past and say, hey, I want to do a PPA, I'd find that I need to kind of gently say to them, have you done other conservation measures around your site? Have you done energy retrofits? Have you really made sure that you already have a really efficient site? Because why focus on lowering your electricity bill through a solar project if you haven't focused on lowering your electricity bill through energy conservation measures first? And I think with Prop 39, with its emphasis on energy conservation broadly, we're going to see a lot of different projects, which I think is probably very salutary. Okay, next slide. And before we move out of the past, I want to talk briefly about the California Solar Initiative. Many of the projects that I've referenced in the past have been funded by the California Solar Initiative, which is now nearly moribund. Starting in 2007, the California Solar Initiative, which was available to not just public agencies, but also businesses and homes, and for those latter entities, for homes in particular, it's still available. But it was enormously popular for public agencies because the program financed up to 100% of the cost of a system, although that financing took place, or that incentive was paid out over 5 years after you installed your project. So it wasn't upfront cash in the way that Prop 39 will be, but it was paid out over the first 5 years of the life of a system. It depended on when you got in line for those funds. Those who were first in line got nearly 100% of their costs covered. Those later in line got a smaller percentage. But Prop 39, CSI was a huge factor in the growth of solar projects that we've seen in recent years. And also, I think, attracted the market in PPAs, attracted private parties into the market. If you are still in line for or have CSI funds, that's great. It really is a bigger slug of cash than what you're going to get out of the Prop 39 program. But if you didn't do CSI, never fear. Prop 39 is the next big thing in this market. It's not at all the same amount of cash or focus on solar projects that CSI was. It's different. So now we're really transitioning from a CSI world into this new Prop 39 landscape. Okay. So what's next? First of all, you may have heard me mention Prop 39 multiple times now. I'm assuming everybody on the call at least has some understanding, but just to be clear, there's the old Prop 39, which, as you may know, changed the rules on GO bonds and also affected charter school facilities offers. That's the old Prop 39, still valid, but now in the way these things work, a couple years ago, there was a new Proposition 39 before the voters, and this Proposition 39, which of course passed, eliminated corporate tax loopholes and in order to create a fund for green jobs and for green projects statewide. And so we're really at the point now where that whole scheme is coming to fruition, and Tyler's going to talk about how that's working out. So that's really, I think, what we're all going to be talking about for the next 4 or 5 years when it comes to energy conservation projects. The other thing I mentioned on this slide, though, is also the renewable energy credit market. It's continuing to be a slow but steady growth in the availability of for two public agencies to sell their renewable energy credits, and that is the intangible benefit of having a energy conservation project that you can sell on a marketplace. Generally speaking, that's something that most public agencies don't have their in-house expertise to do, but it's really worth looking at whether you're sitting on an asset, say, from your solar project that you might be able to monetize. And I'm just going to mention that in passing because it's a technical topic, but it's one to keep an eye on. I think you'll add some depth to the discussion about any project you're contemplating if you ask questions about, well, are there other assets here, intangible assets such as renewable energy credits that we might also consider as part of the economic package of the project at hand. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tyler to talk about where we are with Prop 39.
All right, great. Thank you, Devin. So I'm going to kind of go through a brief general outline of Proposition 39, and then we'll get into some of the details about Prop 39 projects and how entities can apply for those funds. And then after that, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the contracting speed bumps that have arisen as a result of the new legislation that followed Prop 39. So as Devin mentioned, Prop 39 made some changes to the Revenue and Tax Code, which affected corporate tax revenues, essentially increased corporate tax revenue to the state. And Prop 39 requires that a chunk of those new tax revenues be appropriated for clean energy projects. It's important to note that it's corporate tax funding because it's not state construction bond funding. So some of the implications of using those state funds are not at issue when using Prop 39 funds. So Prop 39 added about $550 million of that new corporate tax revenue to the 2013-14 fiscal year for entities to essentially get a piece of for some of these new energy projects. And the implementation of Prop 39 is guided by a couple of important things. I'm going to kind of go through each one of those. And just very briefly, I'll touch on the legislation that immediately followed Prop 39, which is noted on the slide. That's Senate Bill 73. And Senate Bill 73, or SB 73, breaks down how Prop 39 funds are to be allocated, and it provides some additional Prop 39 project and application requirements, as well as giving direction to some state agencies to create regulatory guidance. For example, the Prop 39 guidebook. So the California Energy Commission was required by Prop 39 and SB 73 to develop a set of guidelines that govern the implementation of this program. That process went through a series of public comment periods and eventually resulted in the final guidelines, which were adopted in December of last year. And following that, in January, the Energy Commission released what they're calling the Prop 39 Handbook, which I'm also going to discuss a little bit later, and that gives a little bit further guidance with respect to applying for Prop 39 funds. So with respect to the guidelines, they are exactly what they sound like. They give guidance on Prop 39 program and provide a roadmap for funding allocation, as well as how to apply for those funds and what kind of requirements entities are going to have to adhere to both during projects as well as after projects are completed. So jumping into our first question here on the slide, who can get Prop 39 funds? Prop 39 funds are eligible to what are referred to as local education agencies, which include county offices of education, school districts, charter schools, and state special schools. And Prop 39 funds are also available to community college districts as well. So what facilities are eligible? What kind of projects are eligible? Essentially, Prop 39 projects include any project that can provide energy efficiency or clean energy installation. So this covers a wide variety of projects and includes everything from small projects like light fixture retrofitting, all the way up to more complex and dynamic projects like solar panel installation projects. So with respect to facilities that can benefit from these projects, all facilities are eligible. So there's no requirement that the Prop 39 funds be spent, for example, just on classrooms or something like that. Any facility of an eligible entity is a potential benefactor of these funds. So there are some restrictions that apply, however, to leased facilities, and I'm not going to get into those into too much detail, but if your entity is in a leased facility and you would like to use Prop 39 funds to make improvements to that facility, then you're going to want to at least consult the guidelines and possibly legal counsel to ensure that you're meeting some of those requirements. So moving along here, Prop 39 award allocations. So how much money is available to you? So from the initial annual pot of the Prop 39 money, which is determined every year through the state budget and allocated to the state superintendent. The state superintendent then calculates what portion of that annual pot is available to all of the eligible entities in California. And this is done by essentially compiling prior year average daily attendance, as well as the number of students who are eligible for free and reduced price meals. And those numbers are used to create a proportion that applies to each one of those entities in order to determine how much of that annual pot of money gets allocated to them. So, and these are already available right now. So you can, if you go onto the Energy Commission's website, they have all this information available, and you can find exactly how much has been allocated to your particular entity. And that's sort of like your pot of money that you can have, that you have access to if you go through the process of applying for a Prop 39 project. So for larger school districts that have 2,000 or more average daily attendance, the ADA and the free and reduced price meals is basically the only way that the proportion is determined for those entities. Smaller districts, however, have a minimum funding threshold that they're essentially guaranteed, so that regardless of how small they are, they're at least receiving some portion of these funds for what will inevitably be smaller Prop 39 projects. So this table gives kind of a brief overview of that. It shows there you have essentially 4 different tiers of entity types, and those tiers are determined based on the average daily attendance. So you can see here with the first 3, there is a threshold level that will apply. So 15,000, 50,000, or 100,000 for tier 1, 2, and 3, unless, as noted for tier 2 and 3, unless the ADA calculation results in a higher amount, then those entities will get that higher amount. And there's more information about this. I'm not going to get into the calculation stuff too much, but there's more detail about this part of the process contained within the guidelines. So even though smaller entities are going to receive less money, they do have one tool available to them that can be very helpful in kind of maximizing their resources, and that is the ability to apply for 2 years' worth of Prop 39 funding for the current year. Now, this option is only available to Tier 1 and Tier 2 entities, but if you're one of them, then you can request that both this year's funding allocation and the next year's funding allocation be bundled into your current year pot of money. So applications for this are required on September 1st of each year. So if you apply by September 1st of 2014, you can bundle your 2014-15 year with your 2015-16 year and have those funds available in the 2014-15 fiscal year. So on the other end of the spectrum, there's also a restriction that's imposed on very large project awards. that larger districts will want to be conscious of. And so if your entity receives more than $1 million in Prop 39 money for a project or for projects bundled, then at least half of that $1 million has to be spent on projects valued at $250,000 or more. So the intent of this is to encourage entities that are receiving those large awards to use at least half of that money on big single-site projects, as opposed to sort of spreading it out into smaller amounts among their various facilities. Okay. So, and many of you have already applied for these. These are energy planning funds. This is also a great resource available to entities. These planning funds are only available for the 2013-14 year, and there's no plan to offer the funds again. So there were two application processes for this. One was in the fall of last year, early fall, and the other was in the winter, and there's some rumor that there may be another application process for this coming up in the spring, but that has not been confirmed. So if you did not apply for these energy planning funds, you may still have the ability to do that. But if you have already applied for them, then there are a few categories for which you can use them. And they are kind of outlined briefly up here. So, and I'm not going to go into too much detail as to what all those individual classes of uses for planning funds are. But generally, the intent is to use the funds to make the initial assessment that's required for applying for Prop 39 funds, which includes things like energy audits and benchmarking, as well as general assistance for complying with the prop application requirements. But the funds, as noted, can also be used to hire energy managers and to provide training for classified employees. Okay, so I mentioned that the funds can be used for completing the application process. So we're going to turn now to that and kind of go briefly through how that process works. So the process for applying for and tracking Prop 39 funds is broken down into 8 steps, and I'm going to briefly go through these steps here, but I would encourage you to consult the guidelines for additional information on these steps, because they go into a little bit more detail there. So utility billing data needs to be accessible to the Energy Commission in order for this program to work. And therefore, part of the application process requires you to complete the utility release form that the Energy Commission has developed and provided. And you need to do that when you submit your actual application. It basically gives the Energy Commission access to your utility data to all of your facilities. Benchmarking is a term that refers to establishing essentially a starting point of energy efficiency in your facility as they currently stand. And this setting that benchmark allows you to determine where improvements can be made and where they might be needed the most in an effort to maximize your Prop 39 money. So in addition to that, the process involves a prioritization of projects, which is built off of your benchmarking. So, and that is done in order to determine the best use of your Prop 39 funds. The new statute sets forth 11 different factors for doing that. I'm not going to get into that now. I will not bore you with that, but they are there. They are essentially considerations that the entity has to certify that they have taken into consideration when they developed their prioritization of potential Prop 39 projects. So the last step on this slide is sequencing, which refers to which projects you should do first. So the guidelines recommend, as Devin kind of alluded to earlier, that you begin with energy efficiency measures, energy conservation measures, such as energy management programs or updating current facilities, as opposed to jumping right into an energy generation project like a solar panel project. And that does reflect, as Devin mentioned, a kind of focus, a Prop 39 focus on starting first with how you can reduce your energy uses in your current facilities before moving on to something like putting solar panels on the roof. It's not, however, a requirement. So now, when you are identifying eligible projects, there are 3 general tools that you can select from in order to identify energy measurement. And just quickly, those are energy surveys, including ASHRAE Level 2 energy audits, and what is sometimes referred to as data analytics, which is not as commonly used. There's much more information about those different tools for measuring your energy within the guidelines. And when you get to that point of this process, I suggest that you take a look at those. So your project also has to be cost effective. And the way that this is determined through the Prop 39 program is by achieving what's called a savings to investment ratio of at least 1.05. And this is commonly referred to as SIR. And in a nutshell, what this requires is that the cost of the energy project has to be less than the savings over the life of the project. In other words, economically, the project makes sense. And the Energy Commission has developed some calculators, some online calculators that entities can use for determining whether your project meets the SIR requirement. Those can be extremely helpful, especially for smaller projects. But if you're using those calculators and you're not meeting your 1.05 ratio, then you may want to consider alternatives to those calculators, potentially outside sources or private consultants. There are a number of different ways to go. But the reason why I say that is because apparently we've been hearing that some of the calculations don't always accurately reflect the actual costs and the potential savings that are specific to the entity. Because those calculations that are developed by the Energy Commission are, they take into account averages of lifespans of equipment and averages of utility costs throughout the state. And you might be in an area that has higher utility cost rates or lower utility cost rates, or you might be in a facility that is only operating 6 or 7 months out of the year, or 9 or 10 months out of the year for school districts. And so those different changes can affect your SIR calculation. So if you're not quite reaching that 1.05 mark, then don't give up there. You might want to consider some other methods. So step 7 is the actual application. And that's referred to in the guidelines as the energy expenditure plan. And I'm going to touch on that in a little more detail later. But that's basically the application. And finally, there are some tracking and auditing and reporting requirements for the Prop 39 projects. And they include annual reporting during the project as well as final reporting after the project. And they essentially help establish whether or not the project is actually resulting in energy savings. So keep those in mind when you're moving through your project and after your project. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to the handbook and briefly just touch on the handbook. The handbook, as I mentioned, came out in January, and its focus is to provide a step-by-step guideline for basically filling out and finishing the energy expenditure plan, the application. So there are detailed guidelines within the handbook that I'm not going to go through here, but they walk you through each step, including some explanations and some descriptions of the online software that the Energy Commission developed for applying for these funds, which, by the way, you have to use. These applications can't be mailed in or emailed. There's one system, and it's an online system, and this handbook helps you go through each of the requirements of that system and helps you kind of fill out the necessary data. It's broken down into a few parts depending on whether or not you're leasing or whether or not you own your building. So Form A is, I like to think of it as an application cover sheet. It's your general information. It provides kind of a summary, an overview of the project and the savings and the funds that are being requested. And then Form B is the form used for actual projects, for each individual project. So you can apply for multiple projects in one energy expenditure plan. You don't have to, but you can. And if you are, you'll need more than one Form B. So each Form B is used for one particular project. And as it's noted in the slide, there's some backup material that you will need to provide in that form to substantiate your costs and your savings. So as I mentioned very early on, there's that utility release form that authorizes the Energy Commission to access your utility data. And then if you are leasing the facility, then you will need to provide a building owner certification. So that essentially says that all of the benefits and cost savings of the program that you're implementing into the leased facility are flowing to the school district or whatever the entity is, and not to the owner of the building. And then I also note down here that there are some additional resources that are available both in the handbook, in the guidelines, as well as online on the California Energy Commission's website. There's a ton of information there, so if there are particular aspects that we don't address here today, feel free to, of course, contact us, but you can also check online for some of these resources because they can be very helpful as well. Okay, moving on here. So that's kind of a overview of the process and some of the resources at your disposal. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and get into some of the issues that have come up since the Prop 39 program has been underway. And in particular, what has commonly been referred to as the sole source prohibition or problem. And this issue relates to the manner in which an entity contracts with other parties when those parties are going to be paid with Prop 39 funds through that contract. So this includes contractors who are working on the project and implementing and building the improvements, and includes consultants working on the job and providing assistance in working through the application process and as well as implementing the project. So when you are going to contract with an entity, with a third party for some part of this Prop 39 program implementation, you want to keep this issue in mind. So many of you are already familiar with this issue, but I'm going to just kind of briefly provide the background here so that we're all on the same page. The specific statutory language that gives rise to this issue is quoted here on the slide. And as you can see, it prohibits an entity from using a sole source process to award Prop 39 funds. Now, the problem with this language is that the legislature does not define sole source, and neither does the case law. And so there's very little guidance as to what exactly this means. Now, the legislature does note, as I've also quoted up here on the slide, that an entity can use, that they may use a best value process. They're not required to, but they may use that. And best value is defined by another code section that is the language that is quoted up here on the slide. However, this doesn't resolve the issue. This doesn't provide really any definitive answer as to what sole sourcing is intended to mean in this language and what exactly needs to be done to avoid violating this prohibition. So how can entities do their best to essentially stay out of hot water on this issue? And what kind of process should be considered when you're contracting with these third parties for work involving Prop 39 funds? So sole sourcing, although not defined by the legislature, as I mentioned, can be loosely thought of as the antithesis of competitive bidding. For example, if you have a project and you want Joe Contractor to do it, and you call him up and you tell him the job is his if he wants it, you have essentially looked solely to one source, Joe Contractor, right? You haven't gone to anyone else. You haven't put out for bids. You haven't done a request for proposals. You haven't solicited quotes from anyone. You've gone to one source and one source only. And that is that's a good way to think about sole sourcing when we're moving through some of this material. So as many of you are aware, there are a variety of levels of the competitive process required depending on what kind of work you're doing and with whom you're contracting. And in the example of Joe Contractor, you may have to go through a lengthy publicly noticed competitive bidding process, in which case you would not be allowed to simply call him up and give him the job if the particular job fell into the competitive bidding requirements. So with other forms of contracting, however, such as design professionals or energy consultants, contracts with those kinds of entities involve greater discretion on the public entity when entering into those contracts without formal competitive bidding. And it's this area of contracting where this sole source issue becomes more of an issue, more of a potential problem. So, and as the slide kind of indicates, you're basically dealing with a sliding scale of risk, where the more competitive your process is, then the more likely you are to avoid the sole source prohibition. So the further away you get from just calling up one person and giving them the job, and the closer you get to a formal competitive bidding process, the less likely it is that you can be found to have sole sourced your project. So the most conservative approach, of course, is that competitive bidding process. However, unless it's otherwise required by law, competitive bidding is not necessary to avoid the sole source prohibition. And so what a lot of school districts are doing now to avoid this problem is they're using a request for proposals process, even if they might not strictly be required to do so. So maybe they're contracting with an energy consultant and the process doesn't require a formal request for proposal process. Some of them are doing it anyway just to ensure that they have a good record developed of a reasonable process of evaluating multiple different sources and evaluating different criteria to determine which party is the best party for that contract. So we see a lot of RFPs being used for sidestepping this sole source problem. As I mentioned, though, that might not always be required, and so a slightly riskier method, but one that may be appropriate in certain circumstances, is a less formal request for quotes type of process, where you are not going through as many of the technical hurdles as some RFP processes involve, but you're still going through a similar process, but it's less formal. It may involve less or no public notice, and the scope of the information required from the contracting parties may be significantly less as well. So that carries a little bit of a higher risk, but may also be used to avoid sole sourcing the project. So, in addition to those varying types of contracting methods, one that has been used consistently with energy conservation projects is a process employed under Government Code Section 4217, and I'm going to kick it back over to Devin so that she can get into the details of that kind of process.
Great, thanks. Well, a distinction I want to draw here is that the sole source issue that Tyler was just discussing applies both to the selection of what we might think of as consultants, architects, other consultants, engineers, and also to the selection of contractors. So there's sort of two different strands there, and the RFP process might be one that we might be more familiar with when it comes to selecting an architect or an engineer. School districts don't typically, because competitive bidding, always use an RFP process unless perhaps you're using an RFP process to select in conjunction with lease-leaseback. We don't typically see an RFP process in selecting a contractor, but in this Prop 39 environment, that's exactly what is going on, as Tyler indicated. Regardless, when it comes time to approve your agreement, and now I'm particularly talking about your agreement for the project itself, for the actual construction or installation work, whether that be a retrofit or some other larger scale project, there comes the question of how do we approve that contract. Government Code Section 4217.12 at SAC was until 5 or 6 years ago a fairly obscure exception to the bidding requirements, to the competitive bidding requirements with which we're all familiar. It's been around a long time. It's been around since 1983. But what 4217 provides is that on energy conservation projects, which are defined very broadly by the government code, a public agency may approve such a project without recourse to public bidding if certain criteria are met, and those are certain procedural criteria, and those are that the agency notice a public hearing 2 weeks in advance of that hearing, but that hearing can take place at any board meeting, and at the hearing, the public agency must determine that the project, the proposed project, is in the best interest of the agency and must make certain findings which are stipulated in the government code to the effect that the proposed project is cost-effective and will result in savings. There's some specific language in the statute that I recommend that you look to in making those findings, but those are the simple steps that must be met in order to approve a contract under Government Code Section 4217. In the absence of Prop 39 funds, as Tyler referenced, we have seen plenty of contracts approved simply with 4217 and without any kind of RFP process. If you're going to use Prop 39 funds to select a contractor for an energy conservation project, that I would strongly suggest you also do some kind of RFP process because of the sole source issue, or some other competitive process, so that you can confidently say to the Energy Commission that you did not sole source your project. So now with Prop 39, I think we have this added level of procedure of making sure that you've done a competitive process when selecting your contractor. But if you've done an energy conservation project in the past with the approval under 4217, you'll find the actual approval process in front of your board pretty much identical. And if you haven't, be aware that this is an option for approving projects, and this is how you'll see a lot of energy conservation projects just simply don't go through public bidding. And I don't think that's inappropriate, since we're talking about a kind of expertise here that is not necessarily found, depending on the project, in the general marketplace. Okay, and then the last topic we wanted to talk about is to bring it back full circle to where I started this discussion, which is to talk about power purchase agreements. But before we do that, I just want to remind everybody that in about 5 minutes we'll start taking questions. We have a few already on the docket here, and if you have a question, now's a great time to type it in, again, to the Q&A box. So again, I mentioned earlier that a power purchase agreement is an arrangement where a private entity owns usually a solar installation on the property of a public agency, and the private agency then sells power to the public agency for use at that site. So then the question becomes, and there's been some confusion about this, are those projects such that that Prop 39 funds can be used on PPAs now because of the involvement of the private entity? The answer to that question is yes. PPAs continue to be an option under Prop 39. However, as Tyler indicated in discussing some of the steps involved in approval of Prop 39 projects, there is, I would say, some bias in the guidelines toward funding other smaller scale projects, energy conservation projects, before or rather than investing in a large scale power purchase agreement project. In other words, the Energy Commission seems to have taken the approach that let's take care of all the little stuff that may not be as visible, but may produce greater savings before we go invest in or sign up for a large-scale power purchase agreement. And some other cautions about this, if you're not familiar with the PPA market, PPAs tend to be very long-term, 20 to 25 years. They tend to include restrictions on moving or displacing your installation. They tend to have escalators that will escalate your cost of energy over time. For instance, right now you might see your PG&E bill or other utility bill going up at 2 to 3 to 5% per year. Your PPA is going to assume, in most cases, that that the PPA price, the price you're paying to that private entity, will go up every year at a fixed percentage, 3% or 5% or 2%. So in making that determination whether or not that's a cost-effective scenario, you will need to also be assuming that the PPA rate is lower than what the public utilities rate might be into the future, 20 years into the future. And of course, that's a difficult projection to make with any confidence. Because the Energy Commission has a bit of a reservation about these PPAs, you will find that there are some restrictions on which PPAs and how to do your PPA if you're going to fund it with Prop 39. And specifically, if you're looking to do such a project, I suggest reading the brief Appendix G to the guidelines, which lays out some of the considerations to take into account if you're considering financing your PPA project with Prop 39 funds. And there are several conditions to those PPAs. One is that when you are submitting your application for funds, you're going to need to be submitting also a letter of intent from the PPA provider, explaining such issues as project size, term, energy rate, et cetera, so that the Energy Commission is reviewing the economics and the essential deal terms of your PPA before deciding whether or not to fund the project. That letter of intent, when it includes the energy rate, specifically must include projected cost savings, and those cost savings must be based on the actual electrical utility tariff schedule of the school site at the time. And again, though, that doesn't mean that the energy schedule, that those can be confidently projected into the future, but the Energy Commission is suggesting that we look at the actual energy rates and project cost savings into the future. That ties back into the 4217 discussion that I just covered, where we are required under 4217 to demonstrate that there will be energy savings. And so what we're seeing is sort of a duplication here. You have that 4217 process that you might be using to approve your project, and also you're having to approve to the Energy Commission that there's a potential energy savings here or projected energy savings here. Finally, another consideration to keep in mind is that this Appendix G of the guidelines requires that your PPA have a performance guarantee, and that it guarantee 95% of the production of the system. So if your PPA is projecting that the system will generate a certain number of kilowatts per hour per year, then the entity providing that system is going to need to guarantee up to 95% or at least 95% of that production. And the PPA in the appendix states that if that production falls below the guarantee, then the private entity must reimburse or compensate the LEA for the shortfall. That's an interesting provision. Many, but not all, PPAs in the past have contained some kind of performance guarantee, but I would suggest that you really scrutinize the performance guarantee you're getting in your PPA, because there are a lot of hidden terms and caveats that I think would still pass under this Appendix G, including clawbacks. If your production is low one year but high the next, that you might have to repay the entity. I think that would probably still be okay under this Appendix G, and yet not be very welcoming to the agency. So those are things to keep in mind when you're thinking about Prop 39 funded PPA. Okay, so we're near the end of our hour here. Couple quick questions. Tyler's already addressed this, but we did have a question about the amounts in his table that he covered, and those award amounts are minimum annual amounts, not the total amounts for the life of the Prop 39 funding. We also have a question about the 8-step process. And here's the question: does the 8-step process for applying for Prop 39 funds cover some of the same board findings that are required for energy conservation projects that we've had to include in board resolutions in the past? It sounds like some steps are the same. In other words, I think that the questioner is asking if you've done a prior 4217 approval process and had to establish that there are energy conservation savings from your proposed project, how does that interact with the 8-step process? And it's a really good question, because now you've got a new entity, the Energy Commission, through the funding process, asking you to prove that your project generates energy savings. And while that might be onerous sometimes to go through that whole process and to establish your SIR index, what it has the benefit of is on the back end, when it comes time to approve your project, you will already have hopefully vetted the economics of the project and be able to include in your resolution approving the project findings that demonstrate that kind of cost savings that 4217 has always called for. I think it could be said fairly that some 4217 projects in the past have relied on somewhat flimsy evidence, or at least evidence that's hard to say whether or not those projections will bear out. With the 8-step process, I think we can say with some hope that we're going to be seeing projects that have at least been vetted better for actual savings into the future. So in sum, the 8-step process doesn't take the place of the 4217 approval process. They are complementary or multiple-step processes, but they will rely on some of the same evidence for each of these two procedures. But you will have to do both, the 8-step process and then an approval process in front of your governing board. Okay, so we are now at the end of our hour. I want to thank everybody for attending, and I want to encourage anyone out there who has questions that weren't answered during the session to get in touch with either me or Tyler after this conference call, and in general to let us know if you have questions about Prop 39 or this interesting new landscape as it develops. And thank you very much, all of you, and happy Earth Day. Take care.